Hello everyone, and welcome. This session today we have is basic income in South Africa, which is featuring two sort of sub-sessions with two talks. My name is Jack. I'm here to host the session and any discussions and questions which may follow afterwards. I'm one of the volunteers that's helping with Basic Income Earth Network World Congress this year, which is being hosted by Glasgow. And I'm also the secretary on the board of trustees at Basic Income Network Scotland. I also recently completed a master's in political communication, in which I investigated how online policy advocacy targeted the policy-making process, and I used the basic income movement in the UK as a case study. So I'm really interested in this idea of how we take basic income from idea to reality, which is the theme of the Congress this year. We normally have two volunteers, one hosting and one moderating. However, I'm going to be doing both today, so bear with me if I'm just taking a few minutes to, look at the questions and stuff and try and keep an eye on the chat when we're in the discussion section. Before we start, I just want to go through some housekeeping as well. Actually, 2 seconds. I'm just going to make sure that the auto transcription's enabled. I'm not sure I've clicked that, just in case anyone is hard of hearing or anything like that. Okay, that should be on just now. Sorry about that. So yeah, a couple of housekeeping rules. Please make sure you're on mute unless you're invited to speak. This ensures that you're not cutting across any of the speakers or causing any issues for people who are hard of hearing who depend on the subtitles, which I've just enabled. Please speak slowly and clearly so that the captions can actually pick up what it is that we're saying. The last portion of the session will be a discussion. Please put your questions in the question and answers box on Hoover, as opposed to the chat on Zoom, throughout the session, throughout both talks, and then we'll come back to them in the discussion section at the end. You can upvote the questions that you want to see posed to our speakers, so please do that as well. We should have around 30 minutes for discussion at the end, but we do encourage you to use the chat feature throughout. In case your question cannot be answered, please use the chat feature on Hoover as opposed to Zoom. I have disabled the chat on Zoom, so if you want to go on to the event that you joined with on Hoover, you should be able to post your questions on there. You can also privately message people on Hoover if you want to carry on discussions afterwards. And also we have a roundup session today from 6:30 to 8 p.m. British time, where there will be even more time for discussion. So please join that as well if you can. If anyone has anything specific they need for this session to be more accessible, then please let us know if you can. You can either tell us just now or private message myself, and we'll try and accommodate that for you if we can. Just before we hand over to our speakers for this session, I want to remind you all that our mission with this Congress was to bring speakers and attendees from all over the world together to take basic income from idea to reality. So in this session, we'll be doing this by looking at global perspectives and considering progress on basic income in South Africa. This is split into two sub-sessions, which should last around 20 minutes each. And then at the end, there should be about 30 minutes for discussion where we'll discuss both of the speakers' sort of talks. And we'll go from there. So without further ado, I'll hand over to the first talk, which is South Africa and the battle for the soul of basic income. And then after that, we'll have talk 2 on universal basic income in a time of crisis, redistributive politics in a post-COVID world. So I'll hand over to our first speaker, and they can introduce themselves and the talk.
Thank you, Jack. So my name is Karen Jooste, and I'm the founder of Rightful Share and Income Movement. I actually sent a pre-recording of the talk that I understood you're going to be playing.
Yeah, I can play that. Yeah, if you prefer me to play that, that's fine. Yeah.
Yes, I think it's yeah. I think you can play it, and then I'll take the questions.
Yep, absolutely. 2 seconds. Apologies, okay. I thought you were maybe showing that. That's my own fault.
No, don't worry about it.
Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, I'll play this now.
Hello, everyone. My name is Karen Jooste, and I'll be speaking to you about the fight for the soul of basic income in South Africa. So currently, we are faced with one of two policy options. It's either going to be a basic income grant paid as a rightful share of the economy, or increasing mayhem and asset confiscation. The problem is that in South Africa, the term basic income grant is used interchangeably to refer to both basic income, but also emergency cash and poverty alleviation grants, cash transfers aimed at adults. Now, this might seem insignificant at first, but the consequences are actually quite profound. And I think civil society is faced with a very difficult choice at the moment. It has to decide how it positions itself in relation to the governing party, the African National Congress's statements that it will potentially be implementing a basic income grant. Should it be welcomed? Is it a step towards an authentic basic income grant, or is a more critical approach necessary? I believe we need a more critical approach and a clear distancing from the government's potential targeted means-tested poverty alleviation grant. I think actually we might even have to go so far as to leave the term basic income grant behind in order to preserve its soul. So in South Africa, the debate around basic income have been underway for more than 20 years. And a lot of work has been done by civil society in drawing up documents, working out different models for financing it, rolling it out. It includes work in the early 2000s by the Big Coalition, and then more recently by the Black Sash, the Institute for Economic Justice, the Pay the Grants campaign, and the C19 People's Coalition, to name a few. The debate around basic income actually fizzled out with the collapse of the Big Coalition, but then it was reignited last year with the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic. At that point, the state instituted a 350 Rand, which is very low financial value, but a 350 Rand emergency cash transfer to unemployed South Africans. It was widely welcomed, even though the qualifying criteria was extremely onerous. It included, for example, applicants must be unemployed, not receive any income, not receive any social grant, not qualify for or receive an unemployment benefit, not receive a stipend, and may not be resident in a government-funded or subsidized institution. So even though these payments were clearly not unconditional and universal, the qualifying criteria for a basic income, many people, including civil society, saw it as a stepping stone towards an authentic basic income grant. And this train of thought was strengthened when both the presidency and the Minister of Social Development said, when the social relief grant comes to an end, government is considering implementing a basic income grant. And mainstream media followed suit. There were various articles in the media saying, South Africa may be the first country in the world to implement the basic income. The government wants a basic income for the country, and so on and so on. So I think the conceptual confusion came around quite innocently. On the one hand, there was civil society who recognized the urgent need for an emergency cash transfer and genuinely believed that this could in time be transformed into an authentic basic income grant. And then there's this remarkable ability by the ruling party or the governing party to completely own certain ideas and concepts and terms. So, for example, when you listen to the debate about a basic income that ensued in Parliament, it becomes very clear that a basic income grant is seen as the historical call of the African National Congress. Only they can implement it, and all discussion about it is on their terms. even though what was being discussed during the debate, the means-tested, targeted poverty alleviation grant, is the very essence of what a basic income grant is not. Not even one opposition member was able to point that out. But for better or for worse, I think hope that the governing party would in time implement the basic income grant quickly faded. Because what we saw in the beginning of the year was that the social relief grant was stopped right before the outbreak of the third and most devastating wave. And the former finance minister at that time then unapologetically refused to increase the remaining social grant, saying that, there's no money. But then last month happened. We experienced 9 days of complete anarchy. Shockwaves was sent through the country when we experienced the worst form of violence since the end of apartheid. Terrifying scenes emanated from KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, where cars, trucks, ATMs, pharmacies, malls were set alight, burnt to the ground, looted and completely destroyed. Many businesses and livelihoods were completely destroyed. More than 300 people actually lost their lives. So the question now emerges, in a context where, in my view, the South African Arab Spring has clearly started, the elections have been potentially postponed, and we have significant political realignment going on. How should civil society position itself in relation to such statements? Should it be entertained? Is it really a stepping stone? Is it sincere? Or do we take a more critical approach and a critical stance? And I believe the latter is the way to go, because we now run a very real risk that a targeted, means-tested poverty alleviation grant gets implemented under the auspices of a basic income grant. And when that poverty alleviation grant fails to turn the socio-economic trajectory of the country, the headlines are going to read, basic income grant failed in South Africa. And it will effectively end the debate and usher in a very dark period for us. So I believe it is now the time for decisive leadership and for civil society to shift its attention away from Parliament to the general public and ordinary South Africans and mobilize and educate around what constitutes an authentic basic income grant, why it has the ability to change the socio-economic trajectory of the country, and why we should vote for leaders that appreciate what a basic income grant really is. And I think there are several points, that should be highlighted about why basic income, an authentic one, can work and a poverty alleviation grant can't. Most importantly, I think what needs to be said is that a basic income grant may use age to limit the initial rollout costs, but it never uses income. It's not means tested. It never uses income to decide who gets the money and who doesn't get the money. It is a grant paid on top of any income already made. Now, that has an obvious advantage that the administrative process is fairly easy and straightforward. And often what you find with these sort of means-tested poverty alleviation grants is that all the paperwork actually results in the people that need it most to be excluded. But more than that, under your basic income grant or basic income scheme, you avoid poverty traps. Low-paying jobs actually become more attractive because people can combine that income of the job with that of the grant. They don't have to be scared or fear that the moment they take a low-paying job, they're going to lose this small but reliable income. Poverty alleviation grants are taken away the moment you reach a certain threshold. In this way, basic income is also seen as promoting decent work because people can combine the low-paying job with the grant while they look for something better to do, but they also have enough money in their pocket to say no to a degrading job. Importantly, people can look for job opportunities, jobs, and training opportunities in line with their talent and their skills. They don't just have to do whatever government requires them to do to survive. In our country, you often see that these sort of poverty alleviation grants are linked to exit programs or skills training programs. And the latter comes at great cost to the taxpayer, and they have been shown to not lift people out of poverty. And also, very importantly, as a point that is not often spoken about, but it is that the distribution of these work opportunities are politically determined in rural areas. They are used as a political tool to secure political support. Basic income is paid to many people for a long time, poverty alleviation grant for a small subset of the population for a shorter period of time. Your basic income is paid as a right. It is about recognizing that you need a basic amount of cash to survive in a cash economy. Whereas your poverty alleviation grants in our country also is linked to sort of a package of services. Your grant may very well come in a voucher, and the emphasis is on the package of services, not so much on the cash. The financial value of a basic income grant is also basic, but it is meaningful. Therefore, the emphasis on the upper bound poverty line, because it allows people to spend on more than just food. So it creates demand for local goods and services, growing the economy from the bottom up. It goes without saying that you cannot do this with 350 Rand. The whole point of the basic income is to sort of restructure the economy and create a financial floor which provides people with the security and the ability to combine different income streams in a context where wage work is no longer the norm. Whereas the poverty alleviation grant is a safety net mechanism for people who are perceived to somehow have failed in the economy in the context where wage work remains the norm. That said, a basic income can only do all these things if it is financed from an appropriate source. If it is financed through workers' pockets, like the poverty alleviation grants are, through increased taxes and cuts to service delivery budgets, its impact will be devastating. Civil society has come up with some very innovative taxation models to fund the basic income. But, you know, in a country such as ours, where there's very little trust in government and corruption is systemic, you can't blame people for not wanting to pay more tax. But we can, as I've argued before, use our most comprehensive and powerful policy tool, the Black Economic Empowerment Scorecard. It is actually the most logical place to start, because you can't have a system that creates elite access to the economy operating alongside a system that tries to create a fair access to the economy. These two policies are mutually exclusive. So I think it is time now for decisive leadership, and that the basic income can really be transformative for the South Africa context, but then we have to go about it the right way. I don't believe that the governing party will ever implement a basic income grant. And civil society has spent too much time and energy, and I include myself here, trying to negotiate with politicians that don't care and cannot or will not understand that workfare and small welfare grants are actually part of the problem. We need to shift our attention to ordinary South Africans and mobilize across race and class and educate ordinary South Africans about what constitutes an authentic basic income grant and why we should implement it and why we should vote for leaders that actually appreciate what it really is. And to do that, I think we are going to need a very distinctive approach. We're going to need a new language. And I think we are going to have to abandon the term basic income in order to preserve its soul. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karen. That was a very interesting talk, and I think there's already some themes that have been explored in some of the sessions already. Is there anything that you want to add to that just now?
Yes, let me just quickly explain my situation. I said the pre-recording, my children are very small and their creche is closed due to COVID. So I thought, I can't really control access to the room. So I thought, let me rather say the pre-recording, and then I'm sure that will be done, and then I can just deal with the questions when they come along. But thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm really looking forward to dealing with the questions. A lot is happening in terms of basic income in South Africa at the moment.
Okay, so the plan is we'll move on to our second talk just now, and then we'll take questions at the end. So the second talk that we have is Universal Basic Income in a Time of Crisis, Redistributive Politics in a Post-COVID World. So I'll hand over to our other speakers, Hannah and Liz, for this.
Great, thanks so much. So Hannah and I will be doing this presentation together. So we'll be handing off one from one to the other as we go. So I'm Liz Fuchsman. I'm a lecturer at the Center for Public Policy Research at King's College, and my co-author for this paper is Hannah Dawson. She's a senior researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits University. So I'm going to launch straight in because we have a lot to say. So Hannah and I have been thinking about crisis, crisis as opportunity and crisis as the foreclosing of opportunity. And the idea of crisis as opportunity for political change has been around for a while. There's this saying that gets attributed to lots of different people that you should never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think we've been seeing this discourse of crisis kind of taken up in the basic income community worldwide over the past year. So there's been a lot of excitement over the possible opportunities afforded by the COVID pandemic crisis. And I think this excitement isn't unfounded. So you do see unprecedented experimentation over the past year with sending cash to people. You see this around the world, ranging from North America to South Asia to, in our case study, South Africa. But at the same time, there has been also some questioning of how good a crisis really is for effecting permanent transformation. Because the language of crisis itself seems to point to a kind of exceptionalism. If a crisis is an exceptional event, then solutions to it or interventions to it also are temporary. And there's also an implicit assumption when we talk about a crisis that we're seeking to return to a kind of pre-crisis normality. And I think you can really see this with the example of the 2008 financial crisis, where there's also a lot of excitement, particularly on the left, around this being a kind of, a death of neoliberal capitalism and a kind of transformation of the economy. And a lot of this excitement proved not to bear any fruit, and people have been very disappointed in kind of the decade since. So in this paper, what Hannah and I want to do is to look to South Africa as a case study in order to examine the political possibilities for basic income that have been opened up or perhaps not opened up by the COVID-19 crisis. And we're going to do this in two ways. We're going to build on both a kind of policy analysis from above, and we're going to look at both government and civil society discourse and action to do so. And at the same time, we'll be looking at views from below. And this will be based on a survey that Hannah and I conducted back in September and October of over 100 low-income residents of a neighborhood in inner city Johannesburg. And what we're going to argue is that the emergency framing or the crisis framing around COVID could potentially blunt the long-term potential of new policies. And we see this not only by looking at government discourse, but also in our survey as well. So the people we spoke with, or our research assistants spoke with in inner city Johannesburg, support expanding cash transfers and the cash transfer system in South Africa, but also state a preference for job creation as the key intervention they want to see from the state. And in our analysis of this, we really draw out temporality as a key theme, that UBI could be framed in two different ways. One, a short-term resolution for a crisis or for poverty. You know, this is something Karen was speaking to as well, or a kind of long-term structural transformation of distribution. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Hannah for a bit.
Great. Morning, everyone, and thanks so much for those of you who've joined us. And thanks to Liz. So I'm just going to dive straight into a little bit of background in South Africa and kind of thinking about views from above. So South Africa is one of the world's most unequal countries, and this inequality is occurring in a context of ongoing long-term structural unemployment. South Africa has currently an unemployment rate that is over 40%, and this figure increases to over 60% when you look in particular at young people between the ages of 15 and 34. And as Karen also alluded to earlier, in response to these long-term structural challenges, South Africa seriously considered implementing a small universal basic income grant in the early 2000s. But ultimately, this proposal was rejected despite, excuse me, despite widespread support from labor unions and civil society. And this was due in large part to ideological concerns around giving handouts to those who were, it was presumed, should rather be gaining income through waged labor, you know, despite the inability of the labor market now over more than 2 decades to be creating employment for a large proportion of the working age population. So despite these concerns and this debate around a universal basic income in the early 2000s, what South Africa has done is rather, and this is thinking kind of prior to the pandemic, chose to implement a system of social grants that explicitly excluded those who were physically capable of work. And so only those kind of deserving, the so-called deserving poor, receive welfare grants. And that predominantly has included, at least up until now, the elderly, children, and the disabled. So despite these concerns, South Africa's social grant system is substantial and recognized across the globe as having a very substantial system with over 8 million people prior to the pandemic receiving a grant every month. And there is widespread consensus that social grants have contributed significantly to poverty reduction in South Africa. And we see study after study showing the positive impacts of these social grants on health, education, food security, and livelihood activation. So for some time now, the biggest gap in South Africa's social protection system has for a long time been people aged between 18 and 59 with no or little income. So effectively those who are too old to receive the child support grant and too young to receive the old age pension grant. Of course, this social protection gap needing to be really understood in relation to South Africa's structural unemployment. But this very gap in South Africa's social protection system has really been underlined in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the resultant lockdowns, which have been some of the strictest in the world and left millions of people without jobs, income, and support. In many cases overnight, when the lockdown came into place last year. And so while the pandemic and the lockdowns on the one hand made very powerful objections to expanding social protection to this group that's currently been excluded, powerful objections around dependency, laziness, and incentives to work. These objections were very much made redundant by the pandemic. And I think in many ways you can see that that played a role in the state being forced to expand and embrace more universal approaches to social protection. But as has already been said and will become clear in what else we have to say, there's a crucial difference between a kind of temporary cash transfer in response to an immediate set of income losses due to the pandemic and a permanent full universal basic income. So we're not going to go into the various relief measures that the state put in place, but really we want to just focus on the most significant one, which Karen's also referred to, which is the introduction of what was called the COVID-19 Social Relief of Distress Grant, which was particularly seen to be for unemployed persons, those without any income, but important to note is those who were not receiving any other grant at the time. This, as Karen has mentioned, this SRD grant was set at 350 Rand a month, which is below even the food poverty line in South Africa. And it was initially set up for a 6-month period. This, the grant then had 2 short 3-month extensions, which really, in my view, wouldn't have happened without the tireless work of many organizations who've been campaigning for this. But what I think is most significant about the new COVID SRD grant is that it was the first time unemployed working aged adults were included in the social grant system, albeit temporarily. And this is something the ANC government has resisted since 1994. So despite the name of the grant making very clear that it's an emergency and temporary measure, specific only to relieving the distress of COVID-19, many in South Africa celebrated the COVID-19 grant as the first step towards implementing a universal basic income grant. This is a move that's been supported by a coalition of activists and civil society groups, perhaps most notably the Pay the Grants campaign. Yet, despite increased talk of basic income, universal basic income in the media, within the ANC, the ruling party, and within various government departments, never mind the tireless work of many organizations, from the Black Sash to many others, who've advocated for the grant's extension, but also importantly for it to become a more permanent form of income support. The grant was terminated in April this year, and it took what are now being called the July riots that drew attention to the very high levels of food insecurity, hunger, and a real sense of desperation and hopelessness amongst many South Africans for the government to reinstate the COVID grant now up until March next year. So it was an 8-month extension, the longest one we've seen. So the key question we want to ask, and that we've been grappling with, is what are we to make of, if we think of the last 12 months, what are we to make of this kind of stop-start approach, of the reactive approach of the government that seems to have only extended the SRD grant for short periods after pressure from various organizations and movements, and in more recent events after the July riots. And recent events have felt, at least it appears to us in thinking about these things, much like we're back in the early 2000s. And I see Neil Coleman is on this call, Vivian Taylor, so very intrigued to hear what some of the people on this panel think about. But you know, we see in the last year, we've seen a number of organizations coming together to advocate for the extension of the SRD grant and to endorse the need for a basic income. A basic income grant has the backing of the country's 2 biggest labor federations, And there's also growing support for a basic income within at least certain parts of the state. So just in the last month, the president himself announced that the ANC is giving very serious consideration to the introduction of a basic income, and that doing so would show, in his words, would show that the government cares. The Minister of Social Development, Lindiwe Zulu, has very much welcomed this reinstatement of the SRD grant, and has repeatedly argued over the last 12 months and even prior to that, that this needs to kind of pave the way towards a basic income. And the department has been working quite actively on the policy and financing aspects of this. And there's much more that could be said there. But while there's perhaps growing openness to the necessity of a big, within some in government, we still see there's significant resistance. I think this is clearest in the finance ministry, and something that was evident right from the beginning of the pandemic. However, just in recent weeks, the newly appointed finance minister has warned against fostering dependency, especially amongst the youth. And he was quoted in a newspaper saying just the other day that young people should not be condemned to, in his words, a life of being a grant recipient. So the minister's concerns with giving people money for nothing is, of course, a very common prejudice against grants in South Africa, but also globally. And he portrays these kinds of grants as kind of a handout, which will create dependency. And yet, as many have argued, the basic income versus job debate represents a false dilemma. And the persistence of this ideological binary between jobs and grants, along with internal divisions within the state, that I think explain to a certain extent this kind of push-pull, stop-start dynamic, as well as the reactive approach of the state. What we'd argue is that these ideological binaries and the stop-start dynamic also points to very different understandings and visions of a big, as Liz alluded to in the beginning, and I'll hand over to her now.
So in our work, we wanted to complement this view from above that Hannah was just talking about with a sort of view from below. So in order to do so, Hannah and I, with the help of 2 local research assistants, conducted a survey back in September and October of 120 residents of Jeppestown, which is a neighborhood of inner city Johannesburg, where I've been doing research for a number of years now. And Jeppestown is a neighborhood in the inner city with high rates of informal housing, very high rates of unemployment, and very high rates of poverty. And in fact, our survey showed that only about 20% of people at that time relied on any sort of wage income. This was during one of South Africa's lockdowns as a source of financial support. So we asked people what they thought about this emergency COVID grant at the time, and the vast majority of our respondents supported it. Over 83%, in fact, supported the new COVID grant. And when we asked them why, they referred to the very high levels of unemployment that were occurring in Jeppestown at the time. And they also talked about hunger and other basic needs being unfulfilled. And what's interesting is that we also found a really high level of support for making this grant universal. So the grant is pointedly designed to not go to people who receive any kind of wage income. In fact, it has a lot of exclusion problems because of this. But the people we surveyed thought that everyone, including people in part-time employment or informal employment, should be receiving it. And we also saw a really high support for the amount of this emergency grant to be increased to be somewhere between 500 and 1,000 Rand, so to be doubled, really. And when we asked people about making the grant permanent, so making it into a permanent grant for those that can't work, we saw a split. So about half of the people we spoke to supported this idea of a new permanent cash transfer. And the other half thought that it should either continue until COVID ends or until COVID ends and the economy recovers. So this is where you start seeing people sort of backing away a little bit from the idea of doing something that seems to resemble a basic income. But what was interesting is when we asked the same question later in the survey in a rather different way, we saw very different results. So when we asked later on, not whether the emergency COVID grant should be made permanent, but rather whether there should be a new permanent unconditional unemployment grant, we saw much higher levels of support. So 74% of the people we spoke to said they would support such a grant, which we think really points to the point that the way things are framed and laid out really seems to make a difference in people's perceptions and in people's political support. Yet the really interesting contradiction that we came across in our survey is that later on at the end of the survey, when we asked the people we were speaking with to select one social policy that they would support or advocate for as what the government should do for a post-COVID recovery, actually only 6% of our respondents chose a permanent unemployment grant. And we used a permanent unemployment grant as a kind of stand-in for a universal basic income. And in fact, most of the people we spoke to chose either government work programs as their preferred post-COVID recovery social policy, or funding for businesses, startup funding, or training either for jobs or for businesses. So people were pretty evenly split between these three options. After that, about 6% said a kind of a permanent grant to the unemployed, and about 5% chose the least popular option, which was food parcels from the government. And what's interesting is that the most popular selections, this idea of work programs or some kind of training or business funding, already exist in one form or another in South Africa. And in fact, the government has used them or pointed to them as forms of COVID relief, except for the business training. And I think this contradiction really shows the difference between people's willingness to support something versus their preferences and their demand for something. So it's possible to support a policy, but not necessarily for that policy to be the one that's demanded. And reasons that people gave for this is that jobs in entrepreneurship provide independence, security, stability, mobility. There's also reference to a kind of moral framework of jobs. So people said people need to work. Work is more important than receiving free things. And there was some quotes of people saying, you know, we need to stop depending on the government. So you really see the same echo of the dependency rhetoric you hear in the state, actually amongst the people we were talking to. So just to conclude, we think that South Africa is really in a liminal state. And you know, it's very unclear where all of this will go. And from that, you can see that crisis really can open up possibilities, but at the same time, it can also foreclose them. And I think this really points us to questions around what basic income is and what it's for. So do we think about it as a kind of utilitarian intervention meant to alleviate present suffering? Or is it more of a long-term restructuring of the way we do and think about distribution and economic security? And in making that call, we also have to talk about framing, we have to talk about design, we have to talk about the ideological and political underpinnings of the policy and of the idea. We have to talk about how it's understood in relation to other social policies. All of these things really make a difference, and I think really matter in the future politics of basic income. So I'll end here. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much to both the speakers there. I think both of those talks are really kind of getting to what is probably going to become quite an important issue. And, you know, as we've said throughout this Congress, basic income's getting a lot of media attention at the moment. But is this necessarily a good thing when your headlines are saying that Spain's getting a basic income, this country's getting a basic income, but we all know that no country has a basic income. So this is something that we really need to, you know, grapple with and see how this is going to go. I maybe want to. I know I can see, Karen, that on your Hoover event, you've got you posted some polls which maybe we can look at the results of and discuss a bit to start with. So your first poll, you asked, do you think it's problematic that the term basic income is used interchangeably to refer to a basic income grant and emergency social relief and poverty alleviation cash transfers aimed at adults? And we can see from the results of that poll that 81% of people do believe that that's problematic, which I think kind of gets to the issue that we're speaking about, that there's this difference between what advocates know what basic income is and what the public demands. So I maybe think we can chat about that a bit.
Yes. You know, I mean, let me start by saying, you know, I mean, nobody disputes that we really need an emergency intervention. And there's a lot of, you know, a hardship on the ground. But simultaneously, we need to think long term. And my view is that South Africa, you know, we really, conditions has deteriorated a lot, and we don't have a lot of time left. And we only have a small window of opportunity to make these sort of real changes, because I think there's significant political realignment going on. And in my view, you know, the African National Congress only has 37% of support amongst registered voters. Most South Africans are not voting anymore, and you have a lot of strong men, I think, popping up because 2024 is really up for grabs. So this is really the time, I think, to push for basic income, because as I said in the beginning, in my view, we now only have one of two options. It's going to be a real authentic basic income, or it's going to be increasing mayhem and asset confiscation. There's nothing in between. But the problem is that this term basic income has become so politicized. It has become synonymous with the African National Congress. It has become synonymous with it being small, being for unemployed South Africans. It's going to be paid through income tax. And it's become synonymous with many things that are negative in a way. So my argument is, we can either choose to engage all these arguments about, no, it doesn't create dependency. No, it doesn't necessarily have to come through income tax. No, you know, but it takes so much time and energy, which we don't have. So in my view, it is better to just kind of chuck the name and opt for a different name, reframe it completely different, and, you know, go with that. And I do feel, I mean, I said I include myself here. A lot of time has been spent with politicians, you know, and trying to convince them. But I really think the majority doesn't really care. They don't understand. They don't want to understand that, you know, these workfare programs don't work. Small 350 Rand grant is not going to change the socioeconomic trajectory of this country. It's not going to do it. So we have to turn to ordinary South Africans, and we need to mobilize and, you know, go to the streets and build the thing from the ground. And I think in order to do that, you are going to also have to shift the narrative away from rich helping the poor. It has to move towards ordinary South Africans. Because, you know, most South Africans earning between 3,000 Rand to 20,000 Rand and over, I mean, are all really struggling. You know, they're debt ridden, they don't have job security, they don't have income security, and they're angry, or they're completely apathetic, they don't vote, you know, and this makes them vulnerable to politicians to exploit it for all these emotions for their own gain. So we need to focus on terms that can bring together, I want to say, the precariat, for lack of a better word, you know, and not say, oh, this is only for the poor, this is only for the middle class, this is only for the working class. We need terms that can actually pull us together and understand, you know, that we're all struggling with debt. We're all struggling no job security or income security. And it really is urgent times now. So I think civil society plays an incredibly important role in times like this, when there is significant political realignment going on. And obviously there's also place for, I think, different views, and I think a phenomenal amount of work has been done by civil society. But my own view is that there has to be also a clear understanding about what constitutes an authentic basic income grant. Maybe we should call it by a different name. My proposal is a rightful share. But yeah, we have to stand up, and we have to fight for what it really is now. And there can't be any confusion in the minds of ordinary South Africans. And if you speak to ordinary South Africans, they all think, no, it's a mean-tested poverty alleviation grants for unemployed South Africans. And that is the mainstream understanding in the media and both amongst South Africans. And that has to change. It has to change. And we need to figure out a way of doing that, and getting people excited, and getting people to understand that, you know, this can benefit me as well. Yeah, and I just want to add, you know, so I think there's a lot of work being done around the taxation models to fund it, and I'm not opposed to them. I think some of them are really are really good, but I don't think that is the place to start, because the problem in our country, in my view at least, it's not that we don't have enough tax money. It is that the money is not spent in the right place. And part of the reason it's not spent in the right place is because we have systems in place that actually facilitate corruptive behavior, and I use that in a broad sense. And we have a system in place that creates elite access to the economy. So you can pour in more tax, but it's not necessarily going to go, you know, you can't just add tax and then stir and think things are going to work. We have to fix this system that creates elite access. And I think a proper basic income, authentic basic income, is the exact opposite of what the Black Economic Empowerment Scorecard has become. I'm not disputing the intentions in the beginning, but they, you know, we can work around that. And it's also corruption is something that pulls South Africans together because they are all fed up with it. So that could be a place to start. And I mean, another place where we can look for money is, you know, we can run state-owned enterprises at the profit. That's actually also possible if we have a good government. And I mean, then you can start talking about taxation, I think. But tax is it's an emotive issue. You know, you really can't have a rational discussion around it. So that is also why I think, you know, we really need to get like a very new creative way, so that we can preserve the soul, the unconditionality, the universality of it. And that it has to be a high enough value to actually change the structure of the economy. You know, you're not going to do that with 350 Rand. It's not even enough for food.
Thanks. I want to bring in, I think we've got a hand up in one of our participants, Valeria. Sorry, apologies if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. Do you have a question to ask?
Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I'm from Slovenia. I really appreciate all of the discussions in this session. I just want to mention that in Slovenia we have a very similar situation as in South Africa. I would just like to share our decision about the name and how, following the situation where the government have stolen our brand name Basic Income. So we decided we did it for 20 years, building this brand name, and we are not giving it up. We are just making it clear that it's not every basic income good enough. And we started to speak clearly, always unconditional, universal, uniform, individual basic income. So that's our way to make a distinction. I don't want to take more of the time, but thank you again.
Thank you very much. There's also another question that's just gone on Hoover here. Hang on 2 seconds. Have a look at that. So we have a question that's, does freedom dividend resonate as, I'm not sure what that's asking. I think Peter Knight, did you ask that? Would you like to unmute and just ask that? I'm not sure I can understand the question from the Hoover there.
Yes, in the United States, a fair amount of focus group by the Yang campaign came up with freedom dividend as a term that would be appealing to Americans. And given the freedom movement in South Africa, I was wondering whether that might resonate and be a popular term to differentiate the policy from these unemployment grants, which are really far away from the concept of basic income.
I think, it would be interesting, and it would be really nice if some of the universities can do, Liz, you guys can really test and play around with the names. In my own experience, it's been quite a long journey, and I've even called Rightful Share was by different names. When I started out, it was called a cash, creative cash, and it was called a freedom grant at one point. It was called the empowerment grant at another point. It was actually, we played around with the idea of a dividend, but eventually settled on, a share, an economic share. It is because it draws attention to the economy, and it is also, in a way, giving money back to South Africans that is rightfully theirs. It's not a handout. The money belongs to them in the first place. They were denied it because of apartheid. And a lot of the money has been stolen through corruption. So it is giving people their rightful share of their economy. That's, how Rightful Share came to its name. And I find that it kind of resonates with the people that I speak to. But it would be fascinating to have a real, in-depth survey on names that resonate and don't resonate. I think that would be a great study.
Also a question from Isabel, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Thanks to the speakers and shout out to Hannah and to Liz. But just with regards to this question, I think to an extent, the concept of basic income or basic income grant, universal basic income grant, really has a strong place in the current policy arena. It's something that we've worked on through NEDLAC, which is a social dialogue institute in South Africa with government for the last 7-8 years. It's in the green paper that the Department of Social Development released in the last 2 days. I think that the idea of shifting that concept would be dangerous. I do agree that there can be a better refinement of what the definition means. My institute, SPI, has been talking about the BIG for a long time, and after a webinar last night with the ruling party, it was clear to me that the addition of the term universal is useful. So I would argue very strongly against moving away from the concept of basic income. I think the addition of universal is useful. But this is a great session, and thank you very much to the organizers for hosting it. Thanks.
I'm just wondering, does anyone want to come in on that, or will I move to another? There's a few more questions in the chat. So we have a question to Karen. I did not fully understand why you needed to criticize BEE in order to support and promote basic income. I'm a supporter of UBI, but would universal policies alone be enough to redress the racial disparities that have been historically created in South Africa? Quite the question there.
No, I'm not. I'm not criticizing Black economic empowerment. You cannot, and I get very frustrated with sort of mainstream politicians and economists that sort of wants to treat us like we're in primary school. First, we're going to have economic growth, then we're going to focus on skills, then da-da-da-da-da. It's a very complex problem, and you have to kind of get the common denominator, which is income. But there has to be, I mean, there simply has to be a way of rectifying the injustice of the past, because economic growth by itself is not going to do that. And, you know, that is why there was a program, or is a program, like Black Economic Empowerment. And I think, you know, the intentions behind it was great. But I think in the last 20 years, it has morphed into something that was not the plan originally. And, you know, what it is doing at the moment is it is creating elite access to the economy. And we can't continue with a system that creates elite access to the economy. And all I'm trying to point out is basic income is a way of creating fair access to the economy. You know, and I think these two policies are actually mutually exclusive, and that we can use the BEE scorecard to finance a basic income. So what the proposal is that larger companies, large with a turnover of more than 50 million, put their expenditure into a fund, and that fund then directly transfer cash to ordinary South Africans. So it's two transactions, no middleman, no business, no trickle-down empowerment, two transactions. Because the only way you are going to stop abuse and manipulation of that scorecard is if you strip it of complexity into a simple, straightforward system that no one can rig.
Well, that's a dividend.
Can I come in quick, Jack? So there's also very interested to hear more questions and thoughts, and create this as much of a conversation as possible. I mean, I think there's a lot that's already come up, and I think that, you know, I think my in response to what Karen was saying, but also some of what we've been raising in our paper around thinking about what crisis enables or forecloses, but picking up specifically around, you know, Karen was using slightly different phrasing to us in our paper around, you know, what is an authentic basic income? And I think that raises for me a host of other questions which kind of haven't been on the table yet. So the first point I wanted to make was that I think, you know, my sense is that at least those advocating within civil society, but also many people in different parts of the state, I think, are aware of the distinction between a kind of basic income in this kind of truest form, which is premised on a few key principles, universality being one, or that it should be a right of citizenship, two, that it should be unconditional, and three, and I think probably most important, is that it should be kind of a permanent measure. It should have the reliability of it being there every month. I think most people who are engaged in this debate of all sorts are kind of aware of the distinction between it in its truest form and then what is kind of currently politically on the table and what is being discussed. And I think there's a lot of there's a lot of validity in asking us to step back and saying what gets lost with certain kind of conceptions. But I think there's also an important question, which I think is to the credit of those who are working on this very carefully, is to also ask what is socially and politically kind of possible in this moment, and viewing a particular iteration without losing a longer term vision in which that kind of truer understanding is held very much at the center. So I wanted to, and then there's also the question of who decides what authentic is. I mean, do a group of people at the BN conference do that? Do ordinary South Africans decide what is authentic? So for me, the authentic question raises, it means many things. Are we talking about its purpose? Are we talking about the amount, which I think is becoming increasingly a point of contestation, not just amongst academics and politicians, but amongst ordinary people. But for me, it's so that the question of authenticity is partly around the purpose and the design. But I think there's two other underlying questions that are even more important, perhaps, which is what is on the one hand, the problem we're trying to address. And this is not, you know, a lot of what Liz and I are trying to do in our paper is to say that if you view, for example, the SRD grant as a kind of response to a temporary crisis, the policy response is going to take a particular form. If you conceptualize a policy in response to deep structural unemployment and a kind of history of dispossession and racial inequality, the conversation is automatically different. So the underlying question of what is a true, authentic basic income and what should it look like, for me, we don't necessarily have clarity on what the problem is we're trying to address. And two, something much more imaginative, which is what kind of society do we want to build and create? And I think those two questions are connected to that, but I think also take us beyond it. I think this just shows how there's still so much work to be done in how we think about all of these questions as they relate to basic income. So I'll stop there. I'm sure Liz has other things to say.
Yeah, if I can jump in briefly, I know there's also questions. I would echo a lot of the points that Hannah brought up. I mean, I talk about, my work is largely focused on framing, actually. So I talk to people all the time around it. I haven't done the sort of survey that Karen suggested, which would be really interesting about names specifically, but I do see in my work a lot of differences of opinion around basic income depending on how you frame it and where the money comes from and how people understand it. But I wanted to bring up kind of a question for Karen's proposal, and then a kind of related point. Sorry, there's some dogs barking outside, so I apologize if it's loud, my neighbors. So this idea of using BEE as a funding source, I mean, another way of framing that is simply to call it a corporate tax, right? I mean, that's what it is. It's a corporate tax. And I wonder if, and I feel like there are definitely people in this room, this virtual room, who are much better qualified than me to comment on this, but I wonder if that might not be actually much more politically feasible in South Africa at the moment to talk about a new corporate tax funding something like a universal basic income rather than reformulating BEE in order to do so. And I think a reason for that actually links to a broader critique of basic income from the left, which, you know, I'm very much a basic income supporter, but I think we need to take good critiques very seriously and engage with them. And this is the critique that basic income could act as a redistributory measure of resources, but it might not be enough to really redistribute sort of the sources of production, that you could kind of end up with a two-tier economy where you know, a very small class of elite people still control production and the kind of sources of wealth that come from that. And then, you know, everyone else gets, you know, a little sliver of this via this redistributory mechanism. And I think I don't think it's sort of a deathly critique to basic income, but I think it's an important one to really take on thoughtfully. And I think, you know, the kind of the core concept behind BEE is, of course, to spread out this kind of ownership of the sources of production in a way, or access to it. So I feel like there's some political danger there that's worth, you know, thinking about more, even if we do think ultimately, say, a corporate tax is the best way in South Africa to fund something like a basic income. And of course, there are other, just as a final point, there are like even more out there interesting proposals for how to grapple with this critique. So for instance, you could have a corporate tax, or even just some percentage of, say, all stock of publicly traded companies go into some sort of sovereign wealth fund. And then the basic income is, you know, everyone's share of whatever, you know, wealth that sovereign wealth fund has made that year. So you kind of have the same model as a sovereign wealth fund based on natural resources like oil, but instead of it being based on, say, oil revenue, it's based on corporate revenue in a particular country. And then that really is a share of, you know, people really then do own shares of the wealth of the whole economy. So I also wanted to throw out these kind of more out there proposals as well.
Can I just respond to that, Jack?
Yeah, go for it.
You know, like I said before, I mean, some, you know, as Isabel is here, Neil Coleman is here, there's been a substantial work done on the taxation models. It's where do you start, you know? Because if we want to use all this new tax money and we want to use it in the right way, you know, my view is we're probably going to need a new government. And if we want a new government, in my view, you're going to have to get people to vote for it. So you need to get a message that really resonates with the electorate, with ordinary South Africans. The problem I have with, you know, calling it a corporate tax is immediately people think, oh shit, there's a new tax. Whereas the proposal with rightful share is that and you're not doing away with Black economic empowerment. You're not doing away with it. You're changing the scorecard. So you're literally changing the distribution of money, and you're using money that is already there in a more efficient, effective, and socially just way. And once you've done that, you can add other stuff and you can look at other taxes to increase the pool. But it is about where you start. Yes, corporate tax, it immediately sounds like you're introducing something new, which it isn't. It's changing the distribution of something that is already there.
Thanks. I think Neil Coleman, you've had your hand up for a while. Is there something you'd like to ask?
Thanks, Jack. It's more comment. I think it's actually difficult to know where to start. I think Hannah made some brilliant comments, which indicate that this is neither about politics nor about economics. It's about both. It's about the intersection between politics and economics. And, you know, in 1998, we put a proposal for basic income to a presidential job summit in South Africa when I was part of the labor movement then. It was a new idea. And we have on our call here, very privileged to have Professor Vivian Taylor, who drafted the proposals for comprehensive social protection in South Africa in a commission in 2002. Point I want to make is that in that period, you know, this idea was so new and revolutionary in a sense, it didn't really get serious purchase. That the situation has changed fundamentally in South Africa, and the idea that a universal basic income is not on the agenda and that there's only talk of a means-tested small grant for the unemployed, I think completely misreads the situation. It is a highly contested environment in which you've got different interests in society pushing for different conceptions of what a basic income should be. As Hannah says, I mean, people on the left would push a transformative notion, people on the right would push a much more conservative notion, and then a lot of versions in the middle. But, you know, only yesterday, as I posted in the chat, the Department of Social Development published a green paper in which they call for a universal non-means tested basic income guarantee for all adults aged 18 to 59. This is revolutionary. It's a massive breakthrough. And I'm not suggesting that this is because of a huge change of heart within the ruling party, within government, etc. It's as a result of, one, the objective realities which Hannah and Liz have outlined in terms of the deep distress in society, but two is because of the massive mobilization in civil society for this universal basic income. So we're in a very different place now, and therefore, you know, we cannot avoid questions of financing, of the architecture of the grant, et cetera, et cetera. It's no good for activists to posture around what they would like to see, and then when they're asked very hard questions by business people, by Treasury, et cetera, how are you going to finance the grant? What's the shape of it? Who's going to get it? How much is it going to be? Et cetera, you've got to have answers. So there are a lot of us in society, including my institute, the Institute for Economic Justice, and I've posted in the chat a policy brief which we recently produced on financing universal basic income. There are a number of others here as well who've been working on these issues. And therefore, there's going to be, we now are moving beyond the sort of preliminary sort of skirmishes that have taken place over the last 2 decades into the real policy engagement and contestation around not just what a basic income will look like, but how that will relate, as Liz was saying, to the overall issues of transformation, and Karen's, also raising these issues around economic empowerment, et cetera, and a basic income is not a silver bullet. It's got to be combined in a society like ours, which is so, has such deep structural problems, with other interventions to transform the economy. So, these are major issues. And the question of taxation that you're raising, whether a corporate tax, a resource rent tax, now we're seeing a massive commodities boom taking place, which is a structural boom, which is likely to go on for several years. An idea of a tax on super profits, a financial transaction tax, these are things which can be harnessed, resources which can be harnessed, which don't hit the middle-class South Africans, which Karen is worried about. But in the end, all South Africans are going to have to contribute towards this. The final point is that one of the ideas that is in our proposals, but also in the Department of Social Development, is the idea of a social security tax, where everybody contributes a portion of their income, but lower income workers would get more back in the universal basic income than they would contribute through the tax. So there are a lot of creative and innovative ideas. So I would be more upbeat than I think some of the speakers about the potential for a breakthrough at this point, but it is going to be a massive effort. And it may be that South Africa is the first country in the world to have a real universal basic income. I don't think that is an impossible scenario. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Neil. Well, as we're hosting from Glasgow, hopefully maybe Scotland would be able to say the same thing, and we can have a bit of international competition as to who's going to get there first. Yeah, friendly competition, of course. I'm conscious of the time. This session is meant to end at 20 past, and it seems a shame because it seems like there's a very, very lively discussion going. But I think it's my understanding that discussions can carry on in the chat of this event. They can keep going. We can message each other on Hoover. And as I said at the start of this session, we do have a roundup session later on today, 6:30 to 8 p.m. British time, where I believe it's more of an open session for all attendees to get together, and we can talk about some of the kind of pertinent points that we've discussed during the day. But unless does any of the speakers have any sort of concluding comments they'd like to say just before we wrap it up?
Just thanks to everyone, and thanks to you, Jack.
Yeah, thank you very much for the conversation. I think there should be more, and I think all of us in civil society, should make sure we get together and kind of share our ideas, and so that we speak from the same mouth when it comes to the questions about how much it should be, and how it should be rolled out, and so on. But yes, thank you very much for the conversation. It was very nice.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone. I think the session has really got to the heart of one of the sort of crucial issues, which I'm sure will be touched on throughout the Congress. So thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. Bye.